Good morning and welcome to Old Republic Title's third webinar of 2024. My name is Brad Hessian and I'm the North Central Division Agency Manager, and with me this morning is Barbara Gilmore, our North Central Division Counsel. Good morning, Barb.
Good morning, Brad.
We're so happy to have you with us here. We are in beautiful Minnetonka, Minnesota at our company's Minnesota headquarters, and we're going to spend our time talking with you today about surveys. Now, one of the things I'm really excited about for this webinar is that we have our entire underwriting staff here with us from all four of our states. So you'll get introduced to underwriters that many of you haven't met before. In addition to that, we're going to spend our time talking with you about the wide variety of issues that come up with surveys. But before we do that, Barb, we really need to talk about what types of surveys there are and how that works when an agent is reviewing them, right?
Sure, Brad. So first of all, what's the whole topic about survey coverage about? Well, most institutional lenders, if they're not selling their loans on the secondary market, are going to require survey coverage. And generally, buyers who are represented by attorneys often require survey coverage, which means deletion of the survey exception from the final policies. And so we do that in a number of ways, but generally by looking at some form of survey. And there are many different types of surveys that are used in the states in our region. So the gold standard is the Alta NSPS survey, which is primarily used for commercial properties and certified to 2021 survey standards. We may have some kind of a lesser survey, not certified to those standards, but depicting the improvements on the property, depicting the Schedule B2 exceptions, and prepared by a registered land surveyor. Then in the states of North Dakota and South Dakota, you may receive something called a mortgage inspection survey or report, typically used for loan policies only, but often prepared by surveyors. In South Dakota, they're almost always prepared by surveyors. North Dakota may be prepared by a surveyor or a lay person who's familiar with survey standards. In Wisconsin, we may see a CSM, a certified survey map, which are authorized under Wisconsin law and are used when subdividing land into 4 parcels or less. And then in Minnesota, we use something called plat drawings, which are generally prepared by lay people and accompanied by an inspection report. And then we may even see subdivision plats, recorded plats that are filed in accordance with the laws in the several states. They look a little bit different in every state based on the law. And finally, we may even be provided with GIS data, which isn't based on the survey, but may provide us with enough information to delete the survey exception from a residential owner's policy or from a loan policy.
It really is important for you to think about what type of coverage we're giving to whom and for how much money, right?
Right.
The issue of the accuracy of that survey is going to depend largely on what types of coverage we're giving and whether or not they're to the owner or the lender, because our loss to an owner is always a $1, whereas the loss to the lender typically isn't until after the value of the policy is decreased by the amount of the down payment. So our risk is different.
Right, right. So in analyzing a survey, if we're looking at a survey, we're really looking for it to depict where the legal access to the property is, because we ensure access under the policies. So it needs to abut a public street or road, or if it does not, there needs to be a recorded easement establishing access. We look at the location of the improvements on the property to make sure they're well within the property lines and there are no encroachments from our property onto adjoining property or from adjoining property onto ours. And we're looking at any surveyor's notes or notes in the plat drawing which may disclose survey issues or access issues, because those will be carried forward and need to be added to Schedule B2 of the commitment and eventually onto the final policy if they're not resolved in some other manner. In our review of Alta, surveys is more complex. We're looking at to make sure that the legal description on the survey matches the legal description on the commitment. We're looking again at legal access. And again, we're looking at all our Schedule B2 exceptions in the commitment to make sure all those exceptions are disclosed, referenced in the survey, and disclosed on the property, or with an indication from the surveyor that they do not affect the land or they're unplottable for some reason.
That's right.
And again, look very closely at the surveyor's notes. I always go to that immediately. And those surveyor's notes typically end up on Schedule B2 of the commitment and in the final policy.
I think the other thing you need to think about is the age of the survey. Generally, if an agent is handling survey coverage without input from our underwriters, we like that survey to be less than 6 months old. If you have something older than that, though, feel free to reach out to us, and we can often find a way to provide coverage with an older survey.
Correct. We are really authorized under a bulletin issued by our company in 2023 to accept a survey that's less than 10 years old. We have to determine whether there's been any changes to the improvements on the property since that survey was created. But we may be able to work with you on that and take an affidavit from the owner of the property indicating there have been no changes to the property since the survey was.
Or the surveyor, if the surveyor is willing to give
Correct.
that affidavit. And that's one spot where GIS can be really helpful, because if we look at GIS and there's a building that wasn't there on the last survey, then we're going to have concerns about the reliability.
Right,
of the survey.
right.
Well, I think we're ready to get out into the field. So we have a couple of different locations we're taking you today. We're going to look at a commercial property and some of the issues that are involved there. And then we're also going to look at a large residential property and some of the issues that happen as a residential subdivision is being developed over time. So Barb, let's go ahead and get started.
All right.
Thanks
thank
so much for joining us.
Hi, I'm Carter Maxwell, and I'm an underwriter with Old Republic Title.
And my name is Karen Von Ruden, and I'm also an underwriter with Old Republic Title.
And we're here at a site that we've been asked to insure, but we've received a survey, and the surveyor did call out some issues. So we thought this would be a good opportunity to show you some of the types of issues you might encounter and how you should handle them on your commitment in terms of what kinds of exceptions you should be making, or maybe some requirements that you need to add to the commitment. So looking at the survey, the first issue it's raised is access to subject property crosses adjacent properties. Now, as I can see on the survey, and you'll be able to see from the GIS photo, is there's 4 entrances to this restaurant, but all 4 of them actually have to go across neighboring properties to reach the parking lot. I actually happen to be standing here in the grass right next to a public right-of-way, but if I'm the owner of the restaurant and I naturally want people to be able to reach my parking lot, they're not going to want to have to drive their vehicles through the trees across the grass to the parking lot. Obviously, they want to stick to the driveways, but right now the surveyor is telling us that he doesn't necessarily know that they have a legal right to do that. And so that's going to be our first step, to figure out whether there is an easement giving people the right to cross those neighbors' properties and reach our parking lot. So it's not necessarily an issue for us that the cars are crossing the neighbor's property. The issue for us is whether or not they're crossing it without the benefit of an easement. So naturally, your first step is going to be to check whether there is an easement. And that's going to require searching the chain of title on these adjacent properties to see if in fact there is an easement that allows us to do that. If that's the case, we don't have an issue. You don't need to raise an exception in the policy. But if your search finds that there isn't an easement, then we have an issue. And your default setting should be to raise an exception in the policy or in the commitment. Now, you're going to need to, not necessarily just transpose the language the surveyor used, because the surveyor just said they're accessing the property across the neighbors. But you'll need to add language saying things like without benefit of an easement, because that's what the true issue is. That we don't have a recorded document giving them the right to drive across the neighbor's land. So you've raised the issue in your commitment. You've made an exception. Now the question is, what needs to be done about it? Well, one option is simply nothing. Let's say the purchaser has different plans for this property. Maybe he plans to put in a brand new driveway that gives the restaurant direct access to a public right-of-way. So they and their lender might simply say, that's fine, we'll take it with the exception. More likely, though, they'll come back to you and ask, are you willing to insure over this? And that's where it becomes a judgment call. And don't hesitate to contact us to see, to get our opinion on whether or not it's something we can insure over. In this particular case, we'd almost certainly say no, because you can, especially with business owners, even if they've been going along fine for, in this case, probably decades without anyone raising it as an issue, all it takes is a small change for it to become an issue. Right now, this is a Perkins restaurant. Next door, we don't have a restaurant that naturally competes with them. But let's say the new owner turns us into a pizza place. We have a Papa John's on the property next door. Suddenly, the relationship between these two owners is going to become a bit more adversarial. And so what hasn't been an issue for years may suddenly become an issue. And we don't want to get stuck ensuring that owner who now is facing somebody trying to block their access to the property. So now we've reached the point where we've got the exception. We've decided we're not going to just simply insure over the issue. So then the next question would be, what needs to be done to cure this? And the most obvious answer would be to simply get easements from the neighbors. But a couple notes about that, though, is one, you'll need, if you get an easement agreement signed by the neighbors, make sure that everybody with an interest in those properties has signed off. One common problem is that you'll have an owner of a property sign an easement agreement, but their lender, who has a mortgage on the property, hasn't signed off on it. If that mortgage later forecloses, that'll wipe out our easement agreement and we'll be right back to where we were to begin with. Another issue is they'll probably ask you to draft the easement agreement. I would not get involved with that. I would advise them to hire legal counsel to draft the agreement.
The second item identified on the survey by the surveyor on the west side of the property is this encroachment of this landscaping you see. That's trees, very substantial, it's been here a long time. This railing and the stairwell. The survey identifies that the property line goes right through the middle of this section. Therefore, we have an encroachment that you would need to raise on your title commitment. The unfortunate thing about looking at the survey and actually even being here, it's hard to tell whose improvement is this, who maintains this, who claims it. Is it the neighboring property or is it our property that the survey is all about? The agent will need to reach out to the seller or to the seller's agent to find out more information. Is this theirs? Do they claim it? Do they maintain it? And if so, that information will help to determine your exception on your title commitment. Sometimes you may have situations where the lender or the owner might object to your exception of the encroachment. In those cases, there are solutions that we could possibly look at. One being, could you remove the encroachment? Two, could you get an easement for the neighbor for that portion of the property covered by the encroachment? Another one may be, could the neighbor deed you that portion of the property covered by the encroachment? And of course, there's always an option that you could reach out to your underwriter to see, is there affirmative coverage or an endorsement that might be used in this situation? Now, when you reach out to your favorite underwriter, we're going to ask you some questions about this encroachment. One, how long has it been there? Two, how big is it? Is it 5 feet? Is it 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet? All those come into play as to our determination. Another would be, what is the value of that encroachment if it had to be replaced? And of course, what type of policy are you being asked to insure? Is it a refinance or a sale? And then of course, another very important one is, has there ever been any issues with the neighbor regarding this encroachment? Has there been any ill will, per se? So all those things come to help us to determine whether or not we would be willing to provide affirmative coverage or issue an endorsement with the policy. Item 3 on the survey that the surveyor pointed out is that there is a curb belonging to the neighbor right on the property line. For the title commitment, that's really not an issue because it's not impeding our property owner of their use of their property. So we wouldn't necessarily bring it out as an exception. However, since it's listed on the survey, I recommend putting it on your commitment to let everybody know that this curb is that close to the property. The fourth and final item on the survey that the surveyor pointed out are these overhead power lines. They are not located within an easement. However, they do run from the restaurant to the neighboring property down to the right-of-way. This would make you believe that the power is benefiting our insured property. So you wouldn't necessarily need to make an objection to this. You would, however, want to include this on your commitment as an indication that per the survey, there are overhead utility lines.
All right, this property has just had a small sampling of the types of issues you might run across when reviewing the survey. There are a couple other things we want to talk about, even though they don't happen to be issues here. One is with signage on a commercial building. Now, with this restaurant, there's a large Perkins sign right out front. We can see from our survey that that sign is squarely within the boundaries of our property. But what if that sign, instead of saying the name of our restaurant, said, say, Taco Bell, and there was a Taco Bell next door? That would be a strong indication for us that that sign is an encroachment of the neighbor onto our property. Or vice versa, maybe the sign says Perkins, but it's off our property and onto the adjoining property. That would be a sign then that we are encroaching onto the neighbors ourselves. That's something that you, of course, want to call out as an exception. And again, feel free to contact us so we can determine if it's something that we can insure over or what other steps we might need to take.
Well, that sounds like a wrap here, Carter. Let's go get us a pie or some muffins.
Sounds good.
All right, so here we are on location in beautiful New Richmond, Wisconsin. Joining me for the first time today are Tyson Helder, our underwriting counsel for the North Central Division, and our Wisconsin State Manager and Wisconsin Underwriting Counsel, Kate Marlin. Good afternoon, you guys.
Hey, Brad. Hi, Brad.
Thanks so much for joining us. So, we are here today in New Richmond to talk to you about survey issues related to residential property. Today already, you've heard us talk about commercial property back in Minnesota, but there are some very different issues related to residential property. In this case, what we have is a subdivision that we've been asked to insure, and we've actually got an excellent survey, a survey that's presented for us lots of options to be able to talk to you about today. What's unusual about this, and what we would want you to pay attention to first, is that we've been asked to insure 3 parcels here. Standing out here looking at the property, you wouldn't guess it. Parcel 2 is just behind me to my left, and parcel 1 is directly behind me. Outlot 5 is way on the back side of the property, and we'll be talking about that a little earlier. So you do want to make sure that when you have looked at the survey and you've now found the exceptions you want to list as special exceptions, that you're listing them out according to each parcel. Parcel 1 has these particular issues, Parcel 2 has additional issues, and Parcel 5 will have its own set of special exceptions that should appear on Schedule B2. So let's start talking.
Just real quick, because you have other parcels, you'd want to make sure that you checked that the legal descriptions on your commitment matched each of the 3 parcels, because now you've got 3 separate pieces of land to carefully review.
And what's interesting is parcels 1 and 2 are not exactly rectangular. There are some unusual shapes to them, but parcel 5 is a really unusually shaped parcel. You'll see that on the screen, all of the different angles that go with it. So you will want to check that legal description to make sure it matches. So there are a handful of issues that I want to talk about from this particular location. The first of those is the highway directly behind me. Now, it's interesting because the highway itself is straight, the road is straight, but the property boundary is not. And it's unusual for us to see that. There are a couple of reasons. So first, if we go to the furthest property line, which is all the way over at that cultivation by the trees, one of the things you would notice is that that property line runs all the way to the center of the highway. So it's not unusual for us to have a legal description that runs to the center of the road, but when we have that legal description, we need to make sure we call out the exception so that they understand that the public has the right of way and the use of that road. The other thing that's particularly interesting about that legal description is that while it runs to the center of the road, there's also a 15-foot easement that runs next to the road. I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure why it's there. We don't much care, right? There's no access that we're particularly concerned about. But if there's an easement, somebody probably has a right to use it. And so we want to make sure we list that easement as an exception. Because otherwise, if someone comes along trying to use the easement and we don't have an exception, then we're going to have a claim and likely a loss. Now, one of the things, though, that's interesting is that a large portion of Parcel 1, though not all of it, runs to the middle of that highway. But then it jogs in a little bit. It jogs into the edge of the road, runs another couple of 100 feet, and then it jogs in another 20 feet before it runs again. And we spent time looking at this, trying to figure out what it was. And here's what we think. Those jogs in the legal description happen as a result of the section lines. So when the property was platted and originally mapped, the surveyor took different spots at the section line about where that property line was going to run. So some of it runs to the middle of the road, others of it run along the edge of the road, and others run about another 15 to 30 feet in. That's where that easement is particularly important to us, because otherwise we wouldn't have access at that portion. We need to make sure that we have the easement rights that allow us to get across the property. So there are a lot of things that we want to think about related to the road. You'll remember that Barb talked to us at the very beginning about one of the things that survey coverage does is it makes sure there's access. And so this is a really good example of how we know we have access because the legal description runs to the middle of the road. But once we get into this subdivision, there are other access issues we're concerned about. And one of them, Kate, is right here where we're standing.
I was just about to say, Brad, we're standing right on top of one of those issues. If you take a look at the survey, you'll see that this cul-de-sac does creep in and encroach into the parcel behind us. So this is definitely something you would want to note and take special exception for on your commitment in Schedule B2. If you don't do that and this land doesn't get developed by the same developer, you could have an issue with a future developer and the lines that run from the cul-de-sac.
You know, it's really an interesting issue for us because we are standing what's going to be the fourth edition of this subdivision, right? So it's clear that this developer has been successful in building out hundreds of homes. And as we go through the subdivision, you'll see that there's construction going on. But it's also not unusual that a developer goes out of business, right? And the project isn't continued. And so that's why we need to make sure we're calling out these sorts of encroachments. More than half of this cul-de-sac encroaches into parcel 1. The developer put it here so that it would be convenient when he continues to build out the property. But if this developer ceases to develop the property, it's certainly possible that another developer would take over and want it done differently. We don't want to have to pay to remove this cul-de-sac because we didn't list it as an exception. But Kate, the cul-de-sac isn't the only issue, right?
Right.
Tell us what else you see.
What runs off, well, you can't exactly see it, Brad, but what we can tell on the survey is that the sewer and water lines have been coming straight off of the edge or the end of the cul-de-sac here. And again, if it's not the same developer that's going to develop this, this is an encroachment into their property. Aside from that, if somebody else develops something besides a residential property, those sewer and water lines might not be sufficient to work for that kind of development. If it's a large commercial development, perhaps.
Or even houses that have different size, right? So if you're building a house with 2 bathrooms and 1 kitchen, and that's what the development is for, then the municipality is going to require a certain size of water and sewer main. That'll be different if you're building bigger homes.
Right.
So it's important for us to be thoughtful about that.
And the cul-de-sac's a good example of something that logically seems beneficial. The cul-de-sac is your access point. It's how you get to the property. But you might not want the cul-de-sac. You might just want the road. So they'd cut the cul-de-sac off, creating a problem.
And because you could extend the road if you wanted to further into the new part. And Tyson, that brings us to another issue that we found on this survey. You'll notice that much of the property that is not included in the current subdivision is currently being used for agricultural purposes. So tell us what you saw in the survey.
Yeah, on the northeast corner, you can see that there's a fence line and a cultivation line. And I'll be honest, when I was first looking at the survey, I read it backwards. I thought the cultivation line was the neighboring property going on to our property. So I was worried that there was a parties in possession problem. But in reality, if I looked at the survey much more carefully, I would see the cultivation
someone else
line
looked at
followed
it
in.
carefully.
Fine, Kate found it and showed me. Brad had nothing to do with it. Kate found it and showed me how wrong I was. But it's like Brad said at the beginning, it's a busy survey. So in my defense, there's a lot going on, and I was not looking at the right spot. But once we looked at it more carefully and zoomed in, we were able to find that cultivation line and understand that we didn't have a problem with other people encroaching onto our property, but we might have had a problem with our encroaching onto the neighboring property. Now, because it's a development and they're getting rid of the fields, we probably don't have to worry about it. That's something that you can decide with underwriting consultation if we can remove an exception like that. But it's how the parties in possession, the affidavit of the seller, and the survey can interact.
Well, in Tyson's defense, I also use the GIS to help rationalize
Very true.
through that and decide where things went one way or where things went another way.
It's a really good point that using multiple tools in order to be able to interpret the survey and try and figure out what we should be listing as exceptions is what helps us make sure we're doing the best job, not only for the insured, but to make sure that we're mitigating risk. Remember, title insurance is in the business of eliminating risk. We only take unknown risks. And so all of the things we've talked about, the cultivation, where the boundary runs along the road, the addition of the water and sewer lines, those are all known risks, and that's why we're putting them on Schedule B2 as exceptions.
Absolutely.
Well, listen, as Tyson said, this is a very busy survey, and we have some other stuff we want to show you. So let's move to our next location. So Kate and Tyson, one of the things we're most concerned about when we think about providing survey coverage is boundaries. We're always looking at whether or not there are things on the boundaries that could indicate there's a dispute between our potential insured owner and any adjoining owner. And Kate, we have a number of examples here, but one that's really well illustrated. What did you find?
Well, when I traced the boundary of the property here, I found that the fence to behind me on the left here actually does encroach into our parcel. So that's definitely something you would want to take a special exception for in Schedule B2. Now, again, the same developer might be developing this, and it might not be a problem to him, but the future owners are going to have a policy in which that encroachment of the fence is going to be an exception on their policy also.
Well, one of the things that makes this particular parcel unique is that generally we are insuring open land. And so even when we see pieces of fence, and we saw that on the far boundary, right, where it's agricultural property that had two separate owners, and so there were pieces of old fence, and there were trees and landscaping and that sort of thing. In this case, what we have is a relatively new home, I would guess less than 10 years old, with a chain link fence that is similarly relatively new. And so in this case, there likely wasn't a survey done when that fence was constructed. So we have a very new problem here. And if we're going to have a house that abuts it on the backside, it could be a dispute between neighbors, and we certainly don't want to insure that. Now, there are a number of other things we see here that you may not call out on a survey, but that it may be something you'd want to point out to an insured property owner. And Tyson, you had thought about one of those. What did you see?
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at a cul-de-sac here, but if you look on the survey, you can see the plan showed this is going to become a through road. So a T road here and here instead of a cul-de-sac. So that will not only change the size, but also the nature of the neighborhood. These homes that have been pre-built, they were built on the concept of a cul-de-sac. So they've been used to no through traffic for how many years? If I was insuring the transaction for this home in the future, I'd want to let that new buyer know that this is going to change. That way you don't have some issue coming up later, even though that's probably not a title insurance issue, it's a closing problem and something that's really to your benefit to explain and protect the customer for.
And there were a number of other issues like that we've seen, and that Tyson's going to explain in a few minutes about how this property has changed over time. And so while the survey, for instance, reflects a thicket of trees kind of in the center, as we got out here and looked around, we saw that they'd been removed, right?
There's a pile of lumber.
Pile of trees.
There's a
Honestly,
pile of lumber.
There would be a great bonfire for us this evening if we wanted to hang around. But the thicket of trees is gone. Similarly, we noticed on the survey that there was a pond that said had not been previously conveyed. As you get out here, it kind of looks like maybe that pond is dried up. And so then the question would become, if that's going to be conveyed, who owns it? How does it have to be conveyed? All of those sorts of issues. So my point is that what we get by being able to come out and look at this property is a very different view than what you're seeing normally and what we see normally when we're just looking at lines on a piece of paper. So when you send out a commitment that has Schedule B2 exceptions and someone says to you, well, you know what, that's not there anymore, right? That thicket that you called out as potentially being an encroachment, it's been taken down, it's been removed. We may want the surveyor to go back out and to give us some sort of affidavit or to just flat out remove it from the survey, to delete it from the survey. All of those things are fine. But just because the developer tells you, especially if it's self-serving, that's not there anymore. We want someone who doesn't have any skin in the game.
Right.
To be able to tell us that it's changed.
Well, and we may be concerned because just because it's not physically there doesn't mean there aren't underlying legal rights perhaps to grow and harvest that timber or to travel on the land or whatever it could be. And perhaps there's none. Perhaps removing it is sufficient. It's something we've got to investigate.
Well, I would also say sometimes it depends on what that structure is. Is it a
Absolutely.
very old shed? Is it a shed that you could pick up and move? I've oftentimes taken, the word of the realtor and some photos to show that here's where it was. You can see where the dead grass was, and we've now moved it 5 feet over. Sometimes that works for me to remove that exception if requested.
Did you just say you'll take the word of the realtor?
Well, the word of the realtor and
And
photographs
pictures. Trust but
and
verify.
dead grass.
One of the other things we noticed here that we're not going to have a chance to show you, but that we wanted to talk about is we did find a shed, for instance, that is close to the boundary but doesn't encroach in the same way this fence does. One of the things, though, that we want to think about is whether or not there's a setback requirement that somehow would create a problem. In this case, we're not insuring the parcel that had the shed on it, but if we were insuring that parcel, then I would want to figure out, are we in some sort of violation of a setback? And it was less than a foot from the boundary line?
I believe
Right
it.
on.
I am almost certain there is a setback violation that occurs there. And so if we're providing survey coverage, we do want to be thoughtful of whether or not we have any setbacks we have to
Sometimes
think
your
about.
encroachments are only into the setback.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Well, we have one more stop for you here in Wisconsin before we send you on your way and talk with you about how to make exceptions out of these things. So let's move to our next location. So what we're interested in talking about here are some things that appear to show us items on the survey that could be problematic, but as we got out here and looked around, really not an issue. Tyson, what did you see?
Well, we were first looking for a encroaching power line. So a power line that was outside of the utility easement. And we think that single, no longer connected power line is part of that line that used to exist that ran over here into our parcel. But it's been removed. And we're comfortable removing that as an exception because there's no underlying concerns, because there's an existing easement for them to rebuild the power line in.
Well, so there was likely temporary power that was being delivered overhead, and then once the development became permanent, they simply buried that power line underground within the easement. But had we not visited here today, we would have called that out, and perhaps the developer would have accepted it because he knew that it wasn't there anymore, or they might have asked us to remove it. Now, if we came out and saw it ourselves, would we be willing to remove it, or would we want the surveyor to say something about that? Do you have an opinion?
I would want the surveyor to say something about that.
That's
for sure.
right, because it could be that they come back and put it up tomorrow.
Absolutely.
We happen to come out here in between the days when they were simply restringing the power line. But Tyson, it wasn't just the power line that was an issue. What else did you see related to drainage?
Yeah, we've got a large drainage/wetlands area. I couldn't tell from the survey if it's a functioning drainage ditch, so protected by the declarations or to be platted as a formal drainage area, because it's mainly outside of our parcel. So that would have required a little bit of extra investigation if I had concerns. Because with a drainage or retention pond like that, you often have issues with adjoining properties benefiting from it. And so that burdening our parcels and preventing them from manipulating or removing that drainage ditch. But it's labeled as wetlands. And so wetlands are always going to give me extra pause. That's going to have building restrictions, that's going to have use restrictions that we're always going to be interested in making sure we're clearly establishing those as exceptions on the policy.
That's right.
I agree.
And Kate, there was one more issue we saw related to this part of the property, and that's the road behind us, right?
Yeah, the unpaved road behind us on the survey does indicate that there is water and sewer lines running under that area, but there's a note from the surveyor that you would want to call out on as your exceptions to say that although the surveyor does show those, there was no additional underground work being done to confirm that they are there, but to his belief and knowledge and experience, he believes they are there underneath that unpaved road, obviously because they're going to pave the road and they want to get that done before they do that.
Right. So what we're concerned about then when we look at this plat as a whole is making sure that we understand all of the potential risks, right? We only take unknown risks. And so calling out all of the known risks, and there are lots of them here. I think what this example provides for us as we sort of think about how to provide survey coverage is that we really need to spend time with that survey, understand what the problems are, and again, reach out to our underwriting staff. Any of the three of us could help you sort of figure out what the potential issues are here and how we list them on Schedule B2. So that leads us to our next portion of the discussion, and that's how we're going to wrap up today, trying to figure out what you do once you see problems. how it is you put them in the form of Schedule B2 exceptions, and then how it is we work through those in the event there's an issue that someone wants them removed. So let's go ahead and take a look at that issue. Hey Tyson, what a great day we've had together, looking at different properties and talking about issues related to survey. You know, the last thing we want to talk about though, before we send everybody on their way, is what they do once they've looked at the survey. One of my biggest concerns is that agents receive a survey and they're like, check, got my survey, I can remove the survey exception. But that's not the end, is it?
That's right. We can't just take the survey exception off. You've done all the hard work already, so now we need to put that work onto the commitment.
And what that means is listing out the specific things that we've seen. So for instance, when you and I were out on the property in Wisconsin, one of the things you saw was a cultivation line.
That's
How
right.
is it we might call that out?
Well, and it can be as simple as saying items shown on the survey, prepared for, by, dated, reference the project number, and then specifically list those A, B, C, and D. Get the cultivation line as shown on parcel 1. Be as specific as you can. You can use the surveyor's notes, but you might not want to copy them directly. They're not prepared for title insurance exceptions, so you want to think about how that's going to work in relation to the policy, not just to the survey.
And it's also important to not just rely on the surveyor's notes. There are still things you know that the surveyor might not know, or things that are concerning to us that the surveyor might not have listed as a note. For instance, on the property we looked at in Wisconsin, there was a cul-de-sac for an incomplete part of the subdivision that encroached on the parcel we were purchasing, but that wasn't called out in the
Right.
surveyor's note. So we do want to make sure we're looking for all of those things. It's also important to remember that what the surveyor sees has to match what we have in our search. In Wisconsin, we saw a description for an easement, but the power lines going over the top weren't within the easement.
Right.
We have to make sure we're calling out all of those particular issues. Again, if you need help defining any of those easements, feel free to reach out to anyone on our
Certainly.
underwriting staff. That's what we're there for.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks again for joining us. We're so happy that we've had the opportunity to go out in the field and show you some of the things that we think about every day. We look forward to seeing you again with our fourth quarter webinar, and we'll be back with you in just a couple of months. Thanks again for joining us. Take care, and let us know if you have anything you'd like us to give a webinar about.